This podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's new Patreon community, the Global Coffee Think Tank. Check the show notes or head to patreon.com/Mapper Forward to find out how you can become a member today. We are back on the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward with Madeleine, and today we are talking about how the issues that are happening in Hawaii with coffee leaf rust on the farms there, what the flow-on effects of that are to the consuming end of the market. And so, Madeleine, what kind of things are you noticing are flowing on after the coffee has been processed and is ready to be sold to roasteries and to perhaps people who are engaging in the consuming end of the market? How are they being influenced because of coffee leaf rust?
Well, as I touched in the last episode was price, right? That's like kind of the biggest thing that I think people notice. And as the price of coffee from farms goes up, then roasters or anybody else who is maybe reselling that coffee, their prices are going up. And if their prices aren't going up, well, they're going to have some other issues probably down the line. But across the board, like I said before, most farms are raising the price of their green coffee. And so roasters are raising their prices as well. And because production is down, the availability of green coffee is down. It's likely going to be very difficult to source coffee from specifically regions like Maui and Oahu that grow coffee. And it's because those islands have one very large farm each, and they're both affected by coffee leaf rust. And if they run out of coffee, that's it. There's no more coffee coming from those islands. Maui does have a couple dozen other small farms, but they're so small. Like, it is a tiny, tiny fraction of total production in Hawaii that is coming from these other smaller farms on Maui. We see the same thing actually on Kauai too. Kauai has one very large farm. They have coffee leaf rust, and their prices all went up, their yield is all going down. And so just having access to these coffees, I foresee by the second half of this year, we're going to start having some issues. And this is a conversation that we've had with folks who we work with who buy Hawaii coffees. And we just had to have that kind of reality check with them of like, hey, remember a year and a half ago when we told you about this thing that's happening, or a year ago when we told you this is probably going to affect us and then you in some way? We're having those conversations again this year of like, just a reminder, this is what's going on. This is really happening. And here's an update of how this is impacting the industry in terms of prices and yields. And you just need to be aware of this, because you got to have some plan, because here's the real situation is that it is likely that we might not be able to have access. We being like everybody might not be able to have access to these coffees come September, depending on what is going on with their yields. And I foresee that being a problem again next year because of all of these really heavy pruning methods that a lot of people are implementing. So that's going to impact yields for the next year as well. And it also really depends on how well they're able to combat coffee leaf rust on their farms, and if they're able to bounce back from it within the next year or two, or start to at least see some sort of rebound. And so, Hawaii coffee prices are going up and the availability of it is going down. And one, conversation I had with someone is that it is the situation right now that the people with the most money will kind of quote unquote win, because they're able to, these farms are not going to hold inventory for people. They've straight up told us, like, we're not going to hold inventory. We're not going to create a contract with you. Whoever wants to buy this first, they're going to have access to it.
So
I'm
by
not
people, you mean
warehouse
roasters. You mean,
roasters.
right.
Yeah.
So if and a place like PCR who buys green coffee and sells it to their
Mhm.
roasters and whatnot, if you're able to go to a coffee producer and say, we want all of your crop, they're going to say, pay for it up front and you can
Mhm.
have it.
Yeah.
In the olden days, in air quotes, like 18 months ago, everything seems to be going too fast. But in the olden days, you might have been able to come up with an agreement with a coffee producer. And this isn't just in Hawaii, this is in other countries as well, where you could turn around and say,
Mhm.
you know, we'll come up with a payment plan. Once we've taken receipt of the coffee, we can arrange payment, etc., etc.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to exist anywhere anymore.
Yeah, it's still, there are still like the smaller farms that we work with, they'll do that for us. And we basically give them projections for the year, and we
Right.
have an agreement, and we buy X number of pounds every month or every quarter. But these larger operations, especially like I said, Maui has one large farm, Oahu has one large farm, Kauai has one large farm. They're not holding inventory. They're like, so yeah, this with these smaller farms, that's not necessarily as big of a problem, but with these larger farms,
Yeah.
like Maui has one very large, corporate type of farm. Oahu has one very large corporate type of farm. Kauai is the same thing. They are just not going to hold inventory for anyone.
Right.
They're just going to sell it to whoever can buy it first. And at the same time, those farms have their own retail lines, which is awesome. But they're kind of like, if we're holding any inventory, it's for ourselves to be able to sell roasted retail coffee, because they're
Right.
going to higher margin off of that, right? So for them, it's worth it to just make sure, we need to make sure we have our projections and needs met first, and then the excess is what we'll be able to like sell out to anybody else.
Was this something that they pivoted to during COVID? Was this like creating a B2C direct to consumer sales strategy during COVID? Is that something that happened then?
No, this is just how coffee in Hawaii has been for years. Um,
Wow.
yeah, which is why I kind of I wish that we would kind of talk about this being an example of a model of increasing profits for farms, because it isn't even here in Hawaii, it isn't just the big guys who have retail lines. You have small farms that have retail lines. I,
That's awesome.
mentioned in the first episode, one of the things we do here at Pacific Coffee Research for producers is we will provide them with toll roasting services for their own retail lines. So we roast their coffee, they package and sell it on their website.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, and I mean, these are small farms, they're medium-sized farms, and it's just how it has been here for years. And so it's cool to see that. And yeah, so it isn't really like a new thing. It's just that I think a lot of farms are being a little bit more holding their coffee closer to themselves to make sure that they have those their own demands met, their own business demands met too. And so, yeah.
I mean, this is a reality of the way that business is going to be done into the future, right? As we see food supplies become more and more scarce, coffee not being immune from that, more and more scarce for a number of reasons. In Brazil, coffee production is going down because of droughts, because of frost, because of increased price of inputs. In other regions, they add, not only do they have the increased price of inputs because of the war in Ukraine, but you also have coffee leaf rust. And so you've got to figure out as a business where most of your profitability is going to go. Now, if you can create the green coffee and you can roast it and you can sell it, why would you waste that coffee by waste that profit, I guess, by selling the green coffee to somebody else when you can just put that effort into marketing, creating your own end-to-end business? It doesn't make sense. And the technology is making it so much more plausible to do now, right?
Yeah. And I mean, for a lot of producers here, maybe they don't have the ability to just like invest the money in setting up a whole roastery, but that's why we do what we do. And some of them, they don't want to put like all of the effort into marketing, but to be honest with you, this is kind of where Hawaii coffee can kind of like sell itself because it has the allure of Hawaii coffee, right? Um, and yeah, I mean, it's great to see coffee producers who are successful in setting up a business for taking their product through to the end consumer. And we've talked to producers who we work with, who we buy green coffee from, and they thank us because they're like, once you started buying our coffee and then we saw how much you're able to sell our coffee for, we raised our prices. I was like, great, I'm glad you did that. That's awesome, you know, because you like, you're also, as a producer, better valuing your product.
Yeah.
And you know, they're understanding, oh, I can actually like pay myself for this, you know, like I should actually be paying or like considering an hourly rate for all of my work in this, and how much should I be making in an hourly rate. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a part of the Hawaii industry that I think could be helpful for a lot of other growing regions around the world.
How do we, I mean, is this perhaps an opportunity for a company like PCR to start connecting with producers outside of Hawaii and helping them understand the way the Hawaiian community is set up, and perhaps create some of those conversations that should be happening?
Oh yeah. I mean, I have thought about that before I mean, I've spent time in other coffee growing regions and had the opportunity to meet a lot of amazing producers. And I know that for several of the people who I have met and worked with, that is like kind of the eventual end goal. And I think that's awesome. Right. And I think that we need to start kind of like planting that seed and planting that idea with a lot more folks, and just having the conversations of how do you start this? What is the possibility? And also, how can you maybe work with other producers or other companies in your growing region or in your country to help make this a real viable option for all of you, where it's not like a huge financial burden too? Because I think that's intimidating for a lot of producers, is the finances of setting something up like that, and the knowledge and education behind it too. Like I said, roasting or marketing and all of that stuff. People who are coffee farmers are kind of just, a lot of the time they're like, I don't specialize in marketing. I don't specialize in roasting. I specialize on my farm, you know, and this is what I focus on. So I think a lot of what could be beneficial is building a whole ecosystem, a whole community of folks who are just like, well, you can still just specialize on farming, but we'll provide these other ancillary services for you, and you can still gain a higher profit margin on your end product.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome. In the next episode, we're going to have a chat on what's being done to address the issue with coffee leaf rust, because clearly the flow-on effects, from as we spoke about today, the flow-on effects are to the consuming end. They might, like cafes and roasteries may not sorry, clearly I can't talk today, but the coffee may end up being something they can't have access to. Mm-hmm. So the consumer, if they still want access to the coffee, may have to go somewhere else to buy it. They may have to go directly to the producer, and there's going to be less of it. Mm-hmm. So if they want it, they're going to have to pay more. Mm-hmm. So that's a shift in behavior for the consumer. But because of the drop in yield of coffee, and because the producers may be holding on to the majority of their coffee, this becomes a real problem for roasters and the cafes that they usually sell to, because of this limitation of being able to import coffee into Hawaii. That if your customers are used to drinking Hawaiian coffee, and now you can't get access to Hawaiian coffee, you're going to have to completely change your supply chain to be able to meet the requirements of just having a customer base that wants to buy from you. So this ends up with some super interesting dynamics from the consuming end of things. So the economics of it is very, very interesting. But in the next episode, I really want to kind of understand what's being done to address it and who are the players that are involved in the problem solving. So shall we do that?
Yeah, sounds great.
Great. Peace, love, and peanut butter, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.